Hey guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here. So earlier today, I made a very spur-of-the-moment decision that I am going to do a massive read-through of all of the X-Men comics, going back to the very beginning, all the way up to about 1991 or so. And that is around the point where the holes in my X-Men collection start. I pretty much have every X-Men comic from 1963 all the way up to the early 90s, and that more or less includes spin-off titles like X-Factor and New Mutants, and around the time when the miniseries start, like the Magic miniseries or the Kitty Pryde and Wolverine miniseries or Alpha Flight. I have bits and pieces of those series. I don't have like all of Alpha Flight, for example, or all of X-Factor or all of New Mutants, but even those series are starting to be recollected in the Epic collection, so who knows, by the time I get to the 1980s, maybe I will have more of the New Mutant series at my hands. But right now, I am planning to do an issue-by-issue review/summary of every X-Men comic. It's going to be a huge undertaking, and so I'm not going to kill myself like I did with last year's 365-day graphic novel review challenge. I am not even going to give myself a set schedule with this. I'm going to, at the very least, do one issue a week. I know that that's going to take a very long time to get through all of the X-Men stuff that I want to get through, but I'm probably going to do at least 2 videos a week in some weeks. If there's a week where I'm just very busy, or I want to take it slow and take it easy on the X-Men stuff, and I want to do something else like watch a movie or do some drawing or writing or something, then I may only do one X-Men video that week. But I wanted to get back into talking about X-Men on my channel. There was a time a few years ago where I spent about 2 years talking about different X-Men stories, most of them from the 2000s and later, so I haven't really talked about any of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in these videos, and I thought that that would be kind of fun, getting to look at these X-Men comics, look at them through the lens of somebody who has almost an entire one of those bookshelves full of X-Men books. In fact, I do have an entire full shelf full of X-Men books. It's just that some of them I haven't read yet, but it would be neat to look at these X-Men comics through the lens of being a lifelong X-Men fan. I've been a fan of the X-Men for as long as I can remember. I'm 28 years old. When I was a child, the X-Men cartoon from the 90s, that was a big thing. I was a huge fan of that. Not so much a fan of it now, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, I wanted to go ahead and talk about this series. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the first issue of X-Men. It came out sometime late in 1963. It was written and plotted by Stan Lee, co-plotted by Jack Kirby, who did the penciling. It was inked by a gentleman named Paul Reinman, who I've never heard of before in comics. Usually, when you hear of somebody inking Jack Kirby who is not Jack Kirby himself, it's usually Vince Colletta, but I'd never heard of Paul Reinman. And then lettered by S. Rosen, who I had heard of before. I think he did a lot of the lettering on early Silver Age Marvel Comics. And this issue basically has 4 of the X-Men, Cyclops, Angel, Beast, and Iceman. They have already been recruited by Professor X, and they have been living at the X-Mansion for quite a while, and they've been training. They already have their superhero costumes and codenames and everything. They are already there, and then the 5th and final member of the original X-Men joins them, Jean Grey, and then shortly after she arrives at the mansion, they get their first mission together as a team. Magneto has attacked Cape Citadel, I think is what it's called, which is a missile base somewhere in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wildly off on that. But anyway, Magneto has attacked, and he basically wants to prove to the world that mutants are ready to take over the world. He says humankind is not fit to rule the world anymore, so now it's mutants' turn. And then the X-Men go, and they stop him. He runs away, and then the soldiers at the base, they're like, you know what, you X-Men, you guys are pretty awesome, and I'm going to honor your names from now on. And it's very interesting when we look back at the X-Men, there's a lot of stuff that we feel like nowadays in the year 2018, we feel like these things are inherent as part of the DNA of the X-Men, and a lot of that is not yet present here. Number one, the friendship slash breaking down of that friendship, the frenemies status of Magneto and Professor Xavier, that is not here, and that will not be presented in the X-Men for another 20 years. It's the early 80s before that is hinted at. We won't see Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver yet, but I'll go ahead and tell you now that the idea that Magneto is their father, that is also a retcon. That won't be presented until the 80s also. It's actually in an Avengers comic when that gets revealed, but that is another thing that was, a lot of people think that's been around forever. No, that was about 20 years after these characters were introduced. And Magneto as a Holocaust survivor, that definitely was not present here. That was also introduced by by the time Magneto had joined the team in the 80s. So there's a lot of stuff that you might expect to see in this first issue, stuff that you do see in the first appearance of the X-Men in the animated series and in the first X-Men movie. Pretty much that has been a huge part of X-Men outside of comics in animation and movies since they've been doing X-Men outside of comics. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of that stuff is not present here. But there is a lot of stuff here that is kind of introduced, and I wouldn't say that they necessarily play with these concepts as much as you would think, but these ideas are at least introduced. At one point, Professor X tells Jean Grey that the X-Men are here to protect a world that would fear them if they knew about them. And so it's almost hinted that the world doesn't even know about mutants yet, but then in a few issues that will kind of be sorted out, and we will see that some people do know about mutants. But right now, Professor X is kind of introducing a line that has been attributed to being the theme of the X-Men for 40-something years, feared and hated by a world that they are sworn to protect. He doesn't use those exact words, but that is a line that he says here. And it's interesting in this issue, the humans aren't really fearful of the X-Men. They are fearful of Magneto, but that's because he is attacking them, and he is holding the world hostage with all of these missiles. He is a terrifying figure here. He is not an honorable foe who is just misunderstood and has a tragic backstory. He's not an anti-hero. He is a straight-up villain here. Magneto is one of my favorite X-Men characters, but here he is basically just a mustache-twirling bad guy. He looks like somebody who would appear, I don't know, in a story with a mustache-twirling bad guy. In fact, a lot of these characters are very one-dimensional in this issue. It will be a long time before any of them get more personality and more characteristics that make them feel a little bit more fleshed out. Some of them will get fleshed out over the course of the next 60 issues or so. Some of them will stay pretty one-dimensional. Magneto, he is one of those. He doesn't have a whole lot of depth at this point. He won't for quite a while. Iceman, he's basically just the jokester of the team. He doesn't have much more going on at this point. Really, he's one of the ones who stays pretty consistently portrayed throughout the next 30 years or so. He does get a little bit more depth later on, but since he's one of the characters who gets the boot when Chris Claremont comes on in 1975, he is not going to get a whole lot of chance to be fleshed out any more than what he is here once the all-new, all-different X-Men come in about 15 years later, or about 10 years after this issue. And then we have Cyclops and Angel, who are both more or less the same. Cyclops does have a little bit more of that stick-up-his-butt attitude than Angel does, but really both of them are basically the same. Cyclops is barking orders a couple times, and we do see him kind of taking the lead whenever they go to the missile base, but he's not exactly leading the team yet, because there are still several instances where Professor Xavier is telepathically communicating and giving orders while they are in the mission. So it will be interesting to see when Professor X is finally ready to let go and say, you guys can handle this now, you don't need me watching over you and giving you orders while you're out on a mission. And then Beast, he is not actually the science guy of the team yet. We don't get to see him use any of his big 15-syllable words that he's famous for later on. Right now, he's kind of more similar to Ben Grimm from the Fantastic Four. He's kind of saying like, yay bo, at one point he says that, like, yay, let's go do this mission. He says something where, it's one of those words where I'm like, did people from the 1960s talk like that, or is this just something that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby thought that teenagers talk like this? But he says something like that, and then at one point he's like, get your blasted arm off me, I don't want ice cubes on my arm, I want them in my Coke, or something like that. And he doesn't really talk like the science guy that in like 10 or 15 issues he will be portrayed as. So that's another thing that they kind of played around with his characteristics a little bit on the fly. It clearly was not part of his character at this point in this issue. And then Professor X, he is pretty much a butthead. He is very stern with his students. He is barking orders at them like crazy. He also has this terrifying danger room, which is not holographic. If you look at stories like X-Men Season 1, I don't remember if I've reviewed X-Men Season 1 on my channel before, but if you look at that, which is basically set in the same time period as these 1960s comics and slightly setting it in the present day and updating the characteristics a little bit of these characters so that they feel like actual characters, in that, and I'm sure in some of the other comics that do the same thing, they have a holographic danger room, which is something that they did not get until the 1980s. I don't think that it was in response to Star Trek The Next Generation, because I'm pretty sure it was before Next Generation came out. I think Next Generation came out in 87, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm almost certain that they got a holographic danger room long before that, sometime after the Dark Phoenix saga, but before Next Generation. situation. But anyway, here they just have a lot of really scary stuff that if the school board knew about this, they would be shutting this place down in a heartbeat, or Professor X might just wipe their minds of that. We see that he's very frivolous with his telepathic powers in later issues. But anyway, he has like these clamp things that almost crush Angel, flamethrower, and then at one point he sends out like a sonic pulse that if it gets to his brain long enough, then Angel will fall to the ground. Fortunately, he's only like 5 or 10 feet up in the air. Then he has Beast throw a bowling ball at Iceman. He has Cyclops blast Beast and Iceman both, and Beast is thrown into a wall. Iceman doesn't seem to take on any damage, and then when Jean comes in, she immediately starts throwing around her powers. She uses her telekinesis, which at this time she does not have any telepathy. Professor X has telepathy, Jean Grey has telekinesis. Later on, much later on, we will find out that she also has telepathy, but she uses her telekinesis to pull a chair out of Cyclops' arms and then almost hits Beast with it, and then later throws Beast into the air and starts spinning him around. There's another issue, it might even be the next issue, I'm not sure, where she says something like the professor wanted her to only lift her body weight or less. So it's kind of funny here where she's throwing Beast in the air, and then when they're at Cape Citadel, all of the X-Men are using their powers to kind of, I don't want to say bully the human beings, but they're using them to kind of show off. Like Cyclops says, hey, can you give us 15 minutes to try and defeat Magneto? And the General says, yeah, sure. And then all the X-Men are basically just plowing through them. Like Angel flies over them, which no big deal, that's what he does. Beast is playing leapfrog with them. Iceman runs through, and some of the soldiers are like, man, it's really cold in here. And Iceman's like, oh yeah, no problem, I'll be out of here in a minute. And then Jean, she's just like moving them telekinetically, and I can't really tell in that panel if she's like actually picking them up or if she's just kind of like, you know, parting the crowd and running through. And I'm thinking all these guys could have been a little bit more polite when going into the missile base to attack Magneto. And then once they get there, Magneto, he sees that they are five costumed youths, and then he attacks them and says not all mutants are acceptable to be leaders of Earth, which is very different from his later characterization, because right around the time of Secret Wars 2, Magneto is still portrayed as an enemy of the X-Men, especially Secret Wars 1, but he's just enough of an anti-hero, just enough of a not villain, that he is brought to Battleworld with the other heroes. He's not put on the other side of the planet with the villains. And I saw someone online who characterized Magneto as he would be perfectly fine being the janitor in this New World Order where mutants are superior to humans, as long as mutants were superior to humans. He would be perfectly fine being at the bottom of the totem pole as long as all the other mutants got to have their mutant utopia. Some writers don't really portray him that way. I would say if you went back in time and asked Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, they would say that Magneto is very much wants to be in charge of the world, with mutants all being above humans. But later on, they kind of characterize him more as he just believes that mutants are persecuted unjustly, and he wants to see that stop, and then he doesn't have to be in charge of this New World Order that he wants to happen. So that about covers the plot, and about covers kind of the characteristics of these characters. A lot of them really aren't very well developed. Angel, we don't know anything about Angel yet. Professor X, I did want to mention something about him. He tells Jean Grey that he might be one of the first mutants, and that is, of course, later retconned, not too much later. There's an issue within the first 66. It's even, I think, within this book. I don't know if I showed you guys this. This is what I'm going to be looking at when I am reading these Silver Age X-Men comics. I know some people do not like the Essentials because they're in black and white. They prefer these comics to be in color like they were when they first came out. That's cool. If you want to read the color versions of these comics, you need to look at the Epic collections. They don't have a whole lot of them out yet. They may have like 2 for the Silver Age. But anyway, I have pretty much everything from the first 30 years, at least in the main X-Men title, in the Essentials. So that is what I'm going to be looking at whenever I read these comics and review them for you. But anyway, it might even be within the first 25 issues, which is collected in this book, where we find out that Magneto, he tries to recruit Namor into the Brotherhood of Mutants. And I think in that issue they justify this plot by saying that Namor is a mutant. And so we know Namor, he was around back in the 1930s and even earlier whenever he was born, so we know know that he predates Professor X, and then much later we will get other characters like Azazel and Apocalypse who are thousands of years older than Professor X. But right now, Professor X thinks that he is one of the earliest mutants, and he tells Jean Grey that his parents worked on building the atomic bomb. The timeline here is a little wonky. Professor X's parents worked on the atomic bomb. That started in 1942. I actually looked it up before I started filming this video, and this comic takes place in 1963. That would make Professor X 21 years old if he was born immediately after his parents started working on the atomic bomb. Otherwise, if you want him to be older, if you want him to be in his 30s, then he would have been a child living on some nuclear base where they were building the atomic bombs and testing them, in which case he would not be a true mutant. He would be more like the Fantastic Four or the Incredible Hulk or any other superhero who gets their powers after they are born. Mutants generally get their powers, they're born with them, but they don't manifest until they are teenagers. There are a few exceptions to the rule, like Jamie Madrox or even Nightcrawler, who was born looking like a demon. He just couldn't teleport until he was a teenager. But Professor Xavier, if he is a true mutant, then he would have been born sometime in 1942, maybe 1943, in which case he would have only been 20 years old. And so later on, it's not in this issue, it's like 10 issues later maybe, Professor X is thinking about how he has a big crush on Jean Grey. And a lot of people are like, oh, gross, Professor X is a pedophile. It is a little gross because he would be about 20 or 21, and Jean Grey is about 18 years old. It's not as gross as people like to think of it now, where people imagine Patrick Stewart being Professor X, and he's in his 70s, and then these guys are all teenagers. I think all of them are 18 years old, except for maybe Angel and Iceman. Iceman, I think they say straight up in this issue that he's 16, and Angel, we find out later on, once we get into Roy Thomas's run on the book, that Angel was actually already in college when Professor X recruited him. So I believe he is older than everyone else, but most of these guys are 18 or maybe late 17. They graduate from Professor X's school about 8 issues from now. It's really early in the series when they graduate, but then they all still stay at the school, and they still keep doing the same stuff that they've always been doing. But anyway, so that whole love thing between Professor X and Jean Grey, which is kept silent for like 30 years after it's introduced, that is not as creepy as you would think it is, especially if Professor X was born after his parents were working on the atomic bomb. And I believe they don't say it here, he just mentions the atomic bomb, but in the early 90s when we meet a childhood friend of Professor X, they specify that his parents worked on the Alamogordo atomic bomb project, which I guess would have been around the same time as the Manhattan Project and whatever was going on in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but specifically that is where his parents worked, and that's around the time much later whenever we find out that his parents worked with Mr. Sinister and that his mom and dad worked with Juggernaut's father, Kurt Marco was his name, and then later after Brian Xavier died, you know what, I don't have to get into all that now, I'll get into it later. Anyway, most of these characters, they don't have a whole lot of personality, but I'm not going to judge this book too hard because they only have 23 issues to introduce all of these characters, so that's 6 X-Men and a bad guy, and also they have to set up the premise of the series. Feared and hated by a world they are sworn to protect. Not all mutants are good. You're going to have to fight some bad mutants to protect these humans from the bad mutants, and then also you might even have to fight some humans who are going to be scared of you. We don't get a whole lot of the human prejudice in the first 60-ish issues of this series. We do get the Sentinels later on, but we don't get nearly as much of the racism against mutants as you would think from reading this issue. Case in point, the Army is very grateful for the X-Men for defeating Magneto, and if that issue had come out today, the Army would have been throwing bottles and cans at the X-Men after they defeated Magneto. So this is a very interesting start to the series. I can't promise that I'm going to be very enthusiastic moving forward, at least until we get to around 1975 or so, because I am not a huge fan of the Silver Age X-Men. Sometimes Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were really knocking it out of the park. I think that Fantastic Four is really awesome. I think the first 25 or so issues of Avengers is really good. I think that Spider-Man is really good. That's not Jack Kirby, but that's Stan Lee. I think those books are really good, but if you look at X-Men and even Daredevil, which I have talked about before, those books were not not very good. It took them a little while to figure out what worked with those books. In the case of Daredevil, it never really worked until Frank Miller came aboard, although I will say there were a couple of other guys who had some pretty good work on that, like Mark Wolfman and Tony DeZunga. Is that how you say his name? I don't remember. But anyway, with the X-Men, pretty much I've started liking this series once you get up to Chris Claremont around 1975, 1976. Before that, there wasn't a lot of good stuff with the X-Men. There were a few issues here and there that I think were pretty good. When Arnold Drake was on the X-Men in the late 60s, I thought that was really good. But other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot to write home about with the Silver Age X-Men. So you're probably going to see me being pretty harsh on the first, I think it's issue 66 when they stopped doing new issues. So around that point, from here up until that point, you're going to see me be pretty harsh with the X-Men, but I am going to try my best to be fair, and you will see another 65 issues of reviews on this channel for a while, and then I'll be getting into the stuff that I'm really excited about. So in the meantime, this has been a video of me, the Comics Kid 2099, examining the X-Men. I will see you guys later. Have a good one.